Hello, welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. Today we're going to be talking about the topics of procurement and supply chain, but specifically from the perspective of talent. And I'm delighted to say that joining me for that discussion today is Lucy Hardy. Lucy is the Global Head of Procurement and Supply Chain Practice, Odgers Berndtson. She has 20 years experience in executive search, and the practice she leads operates across all industries and both the public and the private sector. So Lucy, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. We know from feedback that the topic of talent is one that our listeners are always asking about, always interesting to hear about. But if we could, I was really interested to start with you and perhaps just understand a little bit about your journey and how you ended up in the world, one of executive search and secondly, specifically in procurement and supply chain executive search.
Of course, thanks for having me, Simon. So like most people in procurement, I kind of fell into it, I think, is probably the term that I hear the most. So I studied economics with French at university. And I had a student summer job working in the factory at Kodak, which my dad worked. And the HR function at Kodak at the time contacted me in my final year to see if I would be interested in talking to them about joining when I graduated, which was, a great surprise and a great opportunity for me, great company, and the opportunity to go into this thing called procurement, which I didn't know anything about. I went along and had a chat with the UK procurement manager at the time, who became my boss, just asked, well, what is it about? What does it mean? And it just sounded really interesting. Opportunity to use what I'd studied in terms of kind of global markets and demand and supply and exchange rates. And obviously Kodak being a global business, I thought, what can go wrong really? So it was the only job interview I had and came with a car allowance. So I thought, yeah, that'll do. I'll take that. Start to pay off my student loan. And I started. So that's how I got into it. And I really, really enjoyed it. It was, it's most people experience, particularly when you start quite young, your stakeholders are much more senior than you are. And I got thrown in at the deep end and I was managing kind of site services and raw materials for a manufacturing site in Harrow.
Right.
And I was part of these global category teams that were mainly led by the US people. And I worked with colleagues in the French site as well. So I got to use my language and really, really enjoyed it. And then a couple of years in, I started to think about my next move. And I went to a recruitment agency who said, it was a specialist procurement agency called Procurement at the time. And they said, well, you could look at one of these buyer roles, or what about joining us? I'd never thought about recruitment. I'd never thought about procurement. And I thought, well, actually, that's a good way of scanning the market properly. I'd done the majority of my SIPs. I've still got my legal module to do, but maybe I'll get around to that one day. Yeah. But I thought, well, actually, the pitch to me was you can stay close to what you've started doing, but try something else. And if you don't like, recruitment, it doesn't work for you, then obviously I've had the opportunity to look at lots of different companies and maybe take a more considered approach if I choose to go back into procurement. So that was in 2000 when I joined recruitment boutique at the time called Procurement. And then I stayed there 10 years. And then I joined Odgers in 2010. So I've always worked in the procurement and supply chain space, recruiting all of that time.
And again, Lucy, you're clearly very much at the top of your game, right, in terms of our industry and people that operate at executive search.
Thank you.
I'm just really interested about your perspective on what makes someone successful in a role like yours. I mean, you understand procurement. You talked about the fact you've done that. I mean, what makes you successful, or what makes a successful executive search person in this space?
I have to ask my clients and candidates or my boss, maybe. But I think for me, so this is a conversation I have a lot with the graduate researchers that come and join me and have worked with me through the years.
Yeah.
They can sometimes think it's because I had that 2 years doing the job.
Yeah.
But I'm not entirely sure it's down to that, to be honest with you. It's 2 years out of 22 years. So it's not a significant period of time. And clearly it gave me the opportunity to technically understand elements of procurement. But I need to understand procurement to a level in the same way that my finance colleagues need to understand finance and my HR peer needs to understand, the main aspects of HR when you're looking to hire talent. But I'm not there to be an expert in procurement. I couldn't do the job because that's not what I'm here to do. And that's not why my clients hire me or my colleagues. Yeah. What we're here to do is to have the networks that we can tap into and we can rely on, we can build relationships, and then we can leverage those networks to find the very best talent in the market. So like I say, sometimes the graduates that have worked with me, I've had to kind of make them feel, you're going to be successful. Don't worry that you haven't done the job. We're not hired to do the job. We're hired to connect people, to have a view, to be inquisitive, to ask and seek out advice and join the dots up to find the right people for our clients. So I think, yes, of course, you need a level of understanding. But remember, not all firms have a specialist in procurement and supply chain. Odgers now in the UK actually is one of the only ones. But you have generalist headhunters who can, one day they'll be recruiting a CFO, the next they'll be recruiting an HR director, they could be doing procurement, they could be doing a CEO, but they know their industry. So you need to have a level of understanding. But beyond that, it's about having curiosity to ask questions. You have to be a people person, I think. You need to be interested in people. You need to be interested in constantly learning. I mean, even 22 years in, there will be roles that I recruit that I don't know. I've not done this before. I've got to get my head around it. It's a very niche role, or it's for the first time recruiting a particular role like that into the UK or into Europe or wherever it might be. So I think you've got to have curiosity, be a people person, be polite, be curious, do what you'll say you're going to do, right? Hit your deadline, speak to people, get back to them, be courteous, help people out. All of that stuff is important. And I think be quite challenging of your clients as well, you know, in terms of why do you want that? And what about this? Or have you thought about doing it this way? It's about being an advisor, I think. Well, I mean, obviously the end game is to find them the right candidate to land in the job, but part of it is about setting it up for success in the first place, which means asking challenging questions and challenging their thinking too.
And Lisa, I'm really intrigued. So, I mean, as you say, you've been doing it a long time. I'm assuming in that period you've interviewed thousands of people for this space, and that you must have mastered that. I'm really intrigued. When you meet somebody new, how quickly can you, at this point, tell whether you think this is a superstar of the sector or not?
Usually it's quite quick, but you know, I don't want to form opinions too early either.
Right.
You know, you don't want to go in with a bias or an unconscious bias and not be aware of that. So when I was recruiting in my previous company, you know, we were looking at mid managers and category managers and moving up towards director level. And I think, you know, when we were interviewing there, it's very much about interviewing technical capability, you know, understanding their training, their process, give me examples of where you've done X, Y, and Z. How did you do it? Why did you do it? What was your process, etc. So much more about the technical competence. When you're recruiting at a more senior level, I think the difference is, and clearly I still test technical competence in case any clients are listening to this, but it's more about leadership.
Yeah.
And about authenticity and about humility and how to drive change and transformation and how to engage with the board and impact and gravitas and all of those things. So that's why I think it can be easier to form an opinion more quickly at the leadership level, because you're not just looking at technical competence, but you are looking at more interpersonal skills. But, you know, not always. You know, there are interviews where they start off really well and then they dip and then you get, oh no, please come back. And then they finish really strongly, or, you know, they might be a little bit more cautious, a little bit need a little bit more teasing out initially, and then they come through extremely strongly. I mean, again, it's interesting. There are great people, even at senior levels, they're not used to always being interviewed. Some people have been in their company and just progressed through for 20, 25 years, and actually they haven't had an external interview in a really, really long time. Clearly they're strong, clearly they're capable, you know, they're operating at the top or near the top of their game, extremely well remunerated, but they're just not used to articulating what they've done, and they're not used to doing that to an external audience. So they can get caught in internal jargon and acronyms. So, you know, again, with people that are great on paper, you've got to think, well, is this just because they're not used to externally verbalizing what they do? Or are there some weaknesses and they actually aren't capable of really of being successful outside of the environment that they've been trained in? You know, you have to go with it through the interview. Always, every single interview that I go into, and I'm sure every peer of mine in the other search firms and client side, you all want it to go really, really well. You know, you're not there to want to trip people up. And so they can weave, they can peak and trough, or at times you just know straight away they're great, you know, and we just got to, and then it becomes more about, okay, but how do we get this person engaged in the process, and how do we kind of start to have them thinking about looking at an external role? Because most of the people we speak with, you know, they're not looking for a role, it's us going to them. They might not have been thinking about looking externally. You know, it's about, again, taking the time, understanding what's important to them, why would they move, what career opportunities they've got if they stay where they are, what does potentially our client offer them. So there's actually quite a lot of selling in this job as well, not just selling what we do to the client to win the search, but actually there's a lot of selling to do with candidates.
Candidates,
Well,
yeah.
particularly in the current climate, organizations want to absolutely hold on to their talent, and it's about, well, how do you get them out? And I think it's also about realizing when it's not right. I'm not interested in pulling a candidate out of a role and getting them to move if they're in a really great place, just so that I can close my client. If it's not right for the candidate, it's not going to be right for the client, and I'm not going to force that just so that I can tick that off my list and say that's another job done, because it never lasts. It's got to be right for both sides.
And I guess you're in a long-term reputation game. I mean,
yeah, I am now.
yeah, unless you have a dramatic career change.
Yeah, so I think, and it's great. One of the things I enjoy the most is a lot of people that obviously my kind of candidate network are, CPO or CPO -1 now. And many of them I've known for 10 plus years. And some of them I've known for as long as I've been in recruitment, so over 20 years. And what's really, really great about it is to be able to ring somebody, and it could be the only time and the first time I've ever approached them about a role. I've known them for 20 years, but it's like, this is the one. I think this is going to be great for you. I know about you. I know about what you're looking for, what your aspirations are. And I'm going to call you about this one. And I think it's a great opportunity. And here's the reasons why. And that's brilliant to be able to do that.
Yeah. You must get asked this question all the time when you meet people, but I'm assuming people are always like, Lucy, how can I get my next CPO job? Or I guess a couple of points to that. What typically is the advice that you would give someone, and maybe to those individuals that you've worked with over that period that are super successful in this space? Are there any shared characteristics or things that kind of baseline of, you have to have that?
So I think in terms of how do you get the role, and I do get asked that a lot, you've got to plan your career. So, you need to take control of it and take ownership of it. You kind of need to know how these things work, because first of all, there aren't that many CPO roles that come to market. And therefore, you need to know, well, what are the routes to market and how can I make sure that if those roles come up, I'm known.
Yeah.
Of course, my job is to tap people on the shoulder and find them. But I think personally, you have to take personal accountability for how you're going to manage your career. So, if you want to think about it, or you think you're a couple of years off, if you're going for a first-time CPO role, you need to start building your profile ahead of time. You need to know the external search firms that might help me here, and you get on our radar, drop a note through, can I have a coffee? No rush, it's not urgent, but I'm going to start thinking about my next move, and it'd be great to be on your radar. And make sure you've got an external profile that is well understood, and because clearly lots of organizations, even at CPO level, will use in-house talent acquisition rather than using a third party like us. You've got to be recognizable to that audience. And then of course the other route is, well, there's a promotion opportunity where you are, your boss might leave, your CPO might leave. So think about, well, how do you get on the shortlist for that? And the way to frame that, I advise people, is, assume your boss gets run over by a bus tomorrow. Obviously, we hope they don't, but if they did, you want to be in a position where your organization doesn't even think about coming out to somebody like me. You're already on the radar. So who are those people that will make that decision in terms of hiring? Your HR director, the CFO, the COO, CEO, whoever it might be, and really ask yourself, do they know me? Actually, have I got enough votes of confidence from the decision-making panel of who appoints the CPO next? Or have I put all my eggs in one basket on my CPO, my direct boss, but actually I'm not known to the wider organization? And if they did have to make a decision about succession, do those people know me? So it's worth kind of thinking about that internally, as well as obviously the external channels. And just one practical thing to be aware of, if our firms, thanks to procurement negotiating terms and conditions, with certain clients, you will be off limits. You're a client of my firm, therefore we're not able to take anybody actively out from that particular organization. So again, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't just come to me, for example, because if your company is a client of my firm at a strategic enough level, I can't help you. So there's a bit of homework to be done in terms of how does this market work actually, and how do I make myself as accessible to it as possible, and a bit of external profiling, and just set all of that up ahead of time. And then in terms of the common characteristics, I think it's clearly you've got to deliver in your job, right? You've got to have a successful track record. You've got to be able to point to what you've done and what you've delivered. In my experience, clients are generally a bit skeptical if somebody's looking to move every couple of years, and it's like, well, actually, how much did you deliver? So when's the right time to think, I've banked that experience now and I can really take it to market? Fellowship, what do your teams say about you? Would people come with you? Doesn't mean they have to, but do people talk about you as a great leader? So I think that's both your direct reports and your stakeholders and your organization that you're working with. And people tend to be quite well networked. and they tend to have peers in other organizations. They know what good looks like. They can pick up the phone to a non-competing CPO and have those kind of offline conversations, bring teams together and create a little bit of buzz about what they're doing within the external marketplace as well. So I think those are some of the key characteristics, but a lot of it at the leadership level is about interpersonal style. Can you mobilize, energize a global team? Do people really enjoy working for you? Are you known for hiring great talent? And do you engage externally with your network and have interesting things to say?
Yeah. That's really interesting. The other thing, Lisa, I was really interested to get your perspective on. There's a lot, you mentioned that period in the last few years of enormous change, and the pandemic is the obvious part of that, but it doesn't seem to be ending in terms of global events. We've read a lot about, in the context of work, things like the Great Resignation, and, the world out post-COVID looks very different. Is that something you think is true? Is it a media story that's convenient? Yeah, really interested in your perspective on that. You probably got closer to it than anyone, right?
Yeah, I do think it's true. And actually, the title of it escapes me for a minute, but McKinsey have written another paper, and it's the Great something, and it will come back to me in a second. But essentially, it's a bit of an evolution from the Great Resignation. So rather than people just leaving the workforce, which is happening, so some of the work I'm doing is as a result of people taking early retirement and just deciding, actually, the time is now. I don't financially need to sign up for the next 5-year cycle. It's been tough on everybody. I think what is more prevalent is people just making decisions to work differently. So not completely exit the workforce, but actually I want to go and be freelance, or I want to do a bit more advisory consulting work. I don't need the money anymore. Obviously, what COVID taught us is, we can live a much more simple life. We don't need to travel quite so much. Being close to family and friends is more important actually than obviously being on the road the whole time. So I think people are making more choices about how they want to work. And then when it comes to looking at job opportunities, what's really important is what's the culture of the company like, and what's their stance on flexible working. And people have made lifestyle choices. They have moved out of London. They have moved to the coast, or moved back closer to elderly parents, for example, which has taken them away from, let's say, London or Manchester or Switzerland, for example. I've also seen an increase in the number of expats that have been overseas wanting to come back. Right. And thinking, actually, it's now time. I'm going to come back because I've realised that my parents are elderly, or kids education. I mean, kids education has always been a factor. There's always a particular point in time when it makes sense and the whole family has to shift back again. But I have seen people be making more personal driven choices about or factoring that in to their career choice.
Interesting. And the other angle gets talked about a lot in our industry is the future of procurement. What's your perspective on that in terms of the talent coming into the space at the moment? Are you excited by that? Do you think it's in a positive place? Do you think the trajectory is good going forward for our industry?
I do. I think I think the role's just going to get more and more broad. But I think in a sense as well, it's be careful what you wish for, which is where it comes back to talent. And for years and years, procurement people have always talked about a seat at the table.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we've both heard that for many years.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
But I have to say, since the pandemic, I've hardly heard that at all, because the pandemic thrust procurement and supply chain leaders into their boardrooms. And I think there's a difference between having a seat at the table and being invited into the room. And I don't really think you need a seat at the table, quite honestly, if you're invited into the room. But I think what that also means is, that the expectation on talent, the expectation on an ability to be credible in that boardroom, to be confident, to have difficult conversations, right? And every conversation is difficult. I think, again, it's a sign of the times, but most of the CPOs I speak with currently, with all the challenges and pressures around inflation, they're either just about to brief the board, they've just come out of a board briefing, or they're with their CFO. They're constantly in that network now, which is fantastic. But obviously, it's a very, very high caliber, well-experienced, seasoned group of individuals that you're coming into very, very regular contact with now. So it's like, you've got to be ready for that. You need to be credible. You need to have that enterprise-wide conversation. You need to have difficult conversations about risk and about choices and about inflation and commodity. And then obviously ESG is a whole nother topic. But because of the breadth of the role, I think what it does mean is that more people from fringe functions could also take on the CPO role, because it's become so much broader than just category management and strategic sourcing. And I think that's not settled down yet. We don't know exactly what's going to end up in scope for a CPO role or not. But what I see, is property comes into it, broader again, enterprise-wide cost transformation of ESG again. So the scope is getting broader, which I think is hugely exciting. But I do think over time it will mean the talent pool becomes more diverse as well, with a broader set of skills competing for those roles because the nature of the job got bigger.
Yeah. Lucy, thank you so much. It's a fascinating conversation. It was really appreciated to get your insights on all of those topics. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please click the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also absolutely love to hear your views. So please do leave us a review on those platforms, or indeed send me a message on LinkedIn. And we'll be back soon for another discussion with senior industry figures.